Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Refinitiv webinar, the first of two events that we will host under the topic Where Compliance Ends and Sustainability Begins. My name is Maria Sanchez Marin. I work in Refinitiv as EMEA Performance Director for the Enhanced Due Diligence business. I will be moderating our webinar today. Look, with COVID-19 affecting most of our lives, perhaps forever, we thought that this would be a very timely event. At a time when knowing who your third parties are can literally save lives, we think it is more important than ever that we strengthen third-party risk programs. We need to understand how these programs must evolve as society's needs are changing at a faster pace than regulation. This webinar had actually been planned before this crisis started, and we did then consider changing the topic at some stage. But we then realized that it has actually become more relevant than ever. We had originally wanted to host it for two reasons. One, because ESG has been taking such center stage on our agendas. And as a result, we have seen that you're looking at how to integrate new types of non-regulatory concerns in your third-party risk programs. We also wanted to do it because from a major survey of hundreds of corporations that we will launch next month in May, actually at the time of the second webinar of this series, we know this is an area where corporations feel perhaps less comfortable in. And it really looks like we got this right because we got almost 1,900 of you to register. Super delighted about it, although I never thought that I would invite this many people to my humble living room in Madrid. So before we get started, I wanted to run through a few housekeeping details about how the app that you're using works. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of buttons. The first one with a question mark is for technical assistance. The second one is for the slides of the presentation that we will be using. The third one is the media player. Fourth is Q&A. You can submit any questions that you would want to raise with our speakers during the whole presentation, but we will have a dedicated session at the end of the speeches during the Q&A. The next button links to the bios of our speakers, and then that's followed by a Twitter live streaming button. I would like to encourage you to join the ongoing conversation connecting with our @risk management account. There's also a hashtag #FightFinancialCrime for live tweeting during the whole of the event. There is a green button as well. That's for today's slides and other useful resources. The webinar is being recorded and it will be sent out afterwards. And finally, the last button that you can see there links to a survey on today's webinar, which you can take at any given time during the session. So with that out of the way, I wanted to quickly introduce you to our speakers, and you will have seen about them before when you registered for the event. Just very quickly, the first one, I'm personally a follower of through social media, through her blogs, etc. So I'm super excited that she could join us today. Is Allison Taylor. She's Executive Director at Ethical Systems with senior roles at BSR, at a New York University Stern School of Business, previously Control Risk, PwC, or Transparency International. The second one is Robert Blood. He's an expert on NGOs and on activism. He founded Sikh Watch, a world's leading research and strategy consultancy on NGOs, where he's supporting many of the world's leading multinationals, financial institutions, and investment managers. And finally, we have Ibtisen Lassoud, a partner in the regional financial crime practice at Al-Tamimi & Company, based in Dubai, with vast experience advising clients on white-collar crime matters around the world. So with that, Alison, to get us started, I thought, given the topic for this session today, it would be great to hear from you. What's your take on how closely aligned these two worlds of compliance and sustainability have been so far, and how you see that they might be evolving?
Sure. Thank you so much, Maria. Hopefully everybody can see my slides right now. So The origin of my interest in this topic was really my own career. As you described, I spent 12 years working for control risks on FCPA due diligence, fraud, corruption, investigations mainly in emerging markets. So was very familiar with the ethics and compliance discipline. Then in 2011, I moved to working in CSR, sustainability, and ESG. And it was really an Alice through the looking glass moment for me when I realized there was a completely different concept of business responsibility and ethics that used completely different terms and completely different thinking, and came at the whole question of how corporations shouldn't be behaving using completely different frameworks. And this is obviously completely logical. The origin story of compliance is the federal sentencing guidelines in 1991 and the development of a function that is really designed to be the voice of the regulator inside the company and to set up processes and systems and controls to deal with various sorts of regulatory risk. The origin story of corporate social responsibility is a progressive movement designed to try to help companies be more responsible about their social and environmental impacts. So completely different roots and completely different histories. But there is not a clean line between the regulated and the voluntary. And so I quickly realized it's more useful to think about these worlds, as this slide shows, as a Venn diagram. There are certainly issues that are purely the domain of compliance, and there are certainly issues that are purely the domain of sustainability. But there are a ton of issues right there that you can see in the middle of this slide where there may not be shared ownership, but there's certainly shared interest and need for alignment. And then the other thing I think here to highlight is that a lot of the trends that have been happening in the world, particularly over the last 5 years, are driving this alignment far more closely. And the slide you're looking at right now really, really describes this. So the first trend right on the left, I'm calling the hyperconnectivity revolution. It's really also the amplifier for all the other trends that I'm going to talk about this morning. The internet is obviously not a new thing, but people, I think, miss the degree to which internet access is still growing exponentially, particularly in the global south and the developing world. And what I'm calling the hyperconnectivity revolution has had a really profound impact on how companies think about and manage risk over the last 5 to 10 years. There has been a fragmentation of media and public debate. There has been far more bottom-up participation in a commentary and how business should behave, primarily via social media. And companies are increasingly having to behave as if everything they say or do may become public knowledge. Reputation is no longer dependent on whether or not you break the law. In fact, as we can see from the current COVID-19 crisis, the public and the media is judging companies not on whether they're meeting legal requirements. It may be perfectly legal to furlough or make redundant the vast majority of your workforce, but it doesn't mean that the general public thinks that's a good idea. So regulatory and reputational risk are becoming increasingly disconnected, and the feedback between corporate behavior and the effect on corporate value and corporate values is becoming much, much tighter. There's also a new whistleblowing model where employees, if they're concerned about what a company is doing, are far less likely to use the internal hotline and far more likely to leak information into the public domain and take their concerns to the media. So increasingly, companies are operating in a fishbowl, and I think that's one of the big things that's driving this convergence in responsible business. The second trend I'd like to talk about is activism and popular anger. So at the beginning of the year, it was predicted that there would be popular protest in an amazing 40% of countries in 2020. Now, of course, now the majority of the world is not allowed to go outside and protest, but it doesn't mean that anger has gone away. And we're really seeing a lot of public concern about rising inequality. There is also underlying in the growth of the middle class, and a lot more people really pressuring their governments to provide social services and education, and becoming increasingly angry and upset about failures in governance. A lot of that is directed at governments, but certainly businesses becoming wrapped up here and pulled into these dynamics and subject to this overall kind of collapse in public trust in government and business. And so really needing to think about stakeholder trust and reputation in real time. The third thing that's happening is this shift from risk management to thinking about impact. So we can see this with anti-corruption controls, and anti-corruption programs have historically been about protecting the corporation from the risk of corrupt government officials and employees that might collude with those officials. But those approaches, while there's a strong international consensus on them, they don't do much to help companies that are trying to operate, for example, in very high-risk markets where there are endemic demands for bribes or facilitation payments. And they don't do much to help companies tackle problems that are too big for one company to tackle alone. So in parallel, and so there has been more thinking about the impact of corruption and the social impact of what is going on in society. At the same time here, we are seeing greatly increased traction for human rights and increased regulation of human rights. And once you start to see areas like trafficking becoming more regulated, and many European countries now starting to require human rights due diligence, many internal compliance teams are now looking at human rights programs and looking at anti-corruption programs and seeing, in fact, there's a lot of synergies and there are a lot of good reasons to bring these two things together and to start to think more about the social impact of corruption and to start to think more about the corporate risk dimension of human rights. The fourth trend I want to talk briefly about is a new focus on culture and behavior. There's actually quite a lot of evidence from the behavioral ethics field that a very draconian approach to corporate compliance is not that effective, that what we really need to do is build commitment to wider concepts of integrity, and we need to empower employees to think about integrity and make decisions based on ethical considerations and not the possibility that they might be punished or fired or fined for regulatory breaches. So there's lots of really interesting research on corporate culture and a lot of compliance teams starting to take ownership of culture and ethics and thinking about how human beings really act and behave. Then I want to talk very briefly about supply chain oversight, which is, I think, the biggest area where we're seeing this convergence of so who thinks about third-party risk, and then the supply chain oversight team, which uses questionnaires and audits and voluntary disclosure to think about ESG issues. There are big challenges with both the due diligence approach and the audit approach, but as supply chains become more regulated and transparency increases, again, a lot of companies spotting that really maybe they don't need to have two separate processes, thinking about voluntary supply chain oversight and regulatory third-party risk, but they can bring that thinking and measurement together and have something that is much more effective and much more transparent. And then the final trend I'll mention is the rise of ESG. So in the last 2 to 3 years, really an exponential increase in interest from investors in environmental, social, and governance issues, which is the investor term for CSR. And this really comes from mounting evidence that companies that have good ESG management perform better financially over the long term. In fact, many ESG indexes doing much better right now during our current economic challenges. And so this increase in interest from investors in thinking about how companies manage their environmental, social, and governance issues, including anti-corruption and third-party risk, is driving this convergence as well. I have this final slide talking more about what compliance teams are doing about all these things, but I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop talking now, and hopefully we can come back to some of these points during the discussion.
Thanks, Alison. And I have a quick question immediately from your remarks. Like, we're seeing this evolution of priorities. How does this affect how these functions are set up within a given organization? Like, who would own this new remit? What do you think is the best approach, or what do you see happening in the industry already?
Sure. So compliance is relatively clear and well organized. There is a debate about the degree of alignment or ownership by the general counsel and the legal team, but compliance is now a pretty clear defined function. Sustainability /ESR, CSR /ESG /corporate citizenship is less clear as a function. Sometimes it reports into marketing, sometimes risk, sometimes compliance, sometimes human resources, sometimes directly to the CEO. So there's a bit less clarity and definition about what the sustainability function is doing. But what I think is happening is less that the two functions are merging. I don't think I'm arguing that the two functions are the same, to go back to my Venn diagram slide at the beginning. But I think at minimum, there is certainly the need for more coordination and alignment. And there is the need for more coordination and alignment between compliance and sustainability and departments like human resources and risk and investor relations and marketing. So what I think we're starting to see from some of the more innovative companies is thinking about more of an integrity governance structure that will bring all functions together that have some angle on business ethics and responsibility, to try and think in a more big picture way about these questions of reputation and responsibility and how companies should position themselves on social, environmental, and integrity issues. So companies like AstraZeneca, Lockheed Martin, Novartis, they are all putting in place these functions that come up to a very, very senior leader and start to try and bring these functions together to think in a more strategic way about these issues, because these issues are increasingly becoming incredibly strategic and drivers of financial value.
Thank you. And just quickly, and then we'll have to move on, but I was wondering, as you were talking, with these new types of responsibilities, that these sort of more aligned, combined units, parts of the company may be having, may be coordinating better. Does this mean that compliance can truly move from being a cost center with all of the implications that has, to more a center of innovation or value generation? How do you see that happening if these two parts of the company start working much more aligned?
Yeah, so this has been a long-term goal of compliance. There's a lot of conversations, right, about compliance having a seat at the table in strategic discussions and really being seen as a more strategic function. So a lot of push towards having more independence and more seniority. You see a lot of that push coming from the sustainability function as well, though the sustainability function is less mature. I guess the pitch I would make to the compliance officers on the line is that to think about regulatory risk as, I mean, I'm sure nobody is, to think about regulatory risk as something that's very fixed and defined doesn't really make any sense anymore. We can see issues where the regulatory context is shifting. So something like cannabis is becoming less regulated. Something like human rights is becoming more regulated. So if a compliance function wants to be strategic and forward-looking, it makes sense to think about how regulation might evolve and how social pressures and public pressures might affect regulation in future. So if you're a compliance officer wanting to see into the future, you want to get with the sustainability team, because what the sustainability team is doing is thinking about how society and environmental needs are evolving. And it's kind of like a canary in the coal mine. It is the function that can help you understand what might be coming down the pipe, and to understand how your reputational risk is shifting. And so precisely can enable you to move to that more strategic and impactful role.
Wonderful, thank you. And maybe this is a good time. I mean, we have such a varied group of companies on the call today, so many sectors, so many jurisdictions, that maybe it's interesting to do now a quick poll and see where participants are at today in this regard, in terms of that alignment between compliance and sustainability. So we have this poll for you that you should be seeing on your screen now, and that is exactly the question. Is your company currently keeping compliance and sustainability responsibilities separate? Do you totally agree? Do you keep them totally separate? They are separate, but you're working on greater coordination. They are, but are looking at bringing them together. Like those two would be different sort of levels in terms of what Allison was describing now, or they are fully merged. They are part of one and the same. So we'll give you a few more seconds, and it will be interesting to see, to finish with this part of the webinar, what is the reality in your companies today? We're going to see the results. So we have 42% where they are kept totally separate. They are working in coordination. Very few still looking at bringing them together, and very, very few where they are fully merged, which I guess follows what we knew, and the sort of tendency that you're saying in terms of seeing more coordination among them. So with that, we're going to move on to the next presentation. Hopefully we have Robert on the line, and it would be great to hear from him now. And we as corporations, we're starting to think about a wider set of risks, like Allison was presenting, as part of our third-party risk programs. We will be looking at ways in which we want to or can prioritize among those risks, looking at ways to get new data about them, understand how those may evolve. Robert, your organization tracks what NGOs are saying with that idea in mind. Could you take us through how do you do that, and why did you decide to do this?
Okay, thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Good, great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I founded and run a company that specializes in listening and watching and talking to NGOs, by which we mean campaigning groups and activists. So we're interested in the kinds of groups that are in America would be called non-profits, in Europe would be called civil society, the groups that lobby, that advocate, that push for policy changes, that put pressure on companies, that create political impulse within markets to change behaviors of consumers or industrial customers. So these are the groups that are really for which the term movers and shakers could have been invented. And by watching these, we try to understand what the emerging issues are going to be in the months and years ahead. So to give business both an early warning system, but also a sense of who the real drivers are, the arguments behind the issues, and helping companies to understand how to manage those issues in a way that both satisfies their customers and also recognizes the increasing demand for sustainability, for environmental performance, for improved standards in human rights and labor rights, and so forth. Having been doing this for some years, it's always amused me how different industries have different terms for essentially the same thing. So much in the same way as the financial sector created the acronym ESG when industry was already using CSR. They're essentially the same thing. Over our time in the energy sector, they like to talk about non-technical risk, by which they mean the problems that occur with projects when basically the local community doesn't want it or the NGOs lobby the government to stop it. In the chemical industry, they like to talk about societal regulation or extra regulation, that is regulation that doesn't come from governments or established bodies, but typically comes from public opinion and the media driven by NGOs. Industrial manufacturers usually use the term license to operate, which essentially is the same thing. Are you able to do what you want to do? Does the public accept that? And consumer companies, they sort of are really the furthest down the line here because they talk about market acceptance. In other words, they recognize that in the end, if your customers won't buy, there's no point introducing a change or an innovation or a market practice. So all of this is really captured in the idea of that transition from compliance to sustainability, that they all recognize in their own way with these different terms. That it's not enough to obey the letter of the regulation. You have to understand the wider regulation that comes from public opinion. And that's really where sustainability fits. A lot of it is still undefined. I mean, notwithstanding the efforts of organizations like the European Union to try to explain exactly what they mean by sustainability. But nonetheless, these are still fairly broad and ill-defined concepts. And it's an area that NGOs have been and continue to be enormously influential in helping to decide what these mean and therefore what the obligations of companies will be in delivering those either defined or undefined requirements. I'm going to attempt to change my slide myself. So how do NGOs actually do this? We've identified four main strategies that NGOs use, and I call them strategies deliberately. These are thought-out programs and campaigns to create policy change. They're not accidents. They're not just putting out statements and demands randomly. They're thinking through what they want to achieve, and they're very smart in understanding the pressure points and the channels of influence required to make that change. And by and large, companies can either be in the way of that process, in which case they often get run over, or they can be part of the process, in which case they are walking alongside the NGOs, helping to mold those changes so that industry can actually implement them in a sensible and economic way. We've seen that a lot in the food and consumer brands, which really have been getting a lot of praise from NGOs for adapting their behaviors to recognize problems like sustainability and labor rights and so forth, whereas other industries are getting a very hard time from NGOs because they continue to resist even contemplating what those changes might be. So in terms of the main strategies, I mean, the first thing that NGOs do is that they actually define the issues, that they define the material risks. We were looking at some work done by an ESG rating agency, and they, for each sector, they list the issues that they need to check on, that their customers, their investment managers want to reassure themselves about the performance of individual corporate entities before they invest. And it was remarkable, every issue that was on the sort of danger list for that rating agency were issues that NGOs had been campaigning on, in some cases certainly for months, if not years. So, you know, what the NGOs had been demanding for a long time was beginning to appear on the decision tree of investors. And that, again, shows how influential NGOs are in defining what sustainability and compliance actually means in this area. By compliance, I mean not the regulatory compliance, but compliance with investors' demands. The second thing they do is that they are very good at calling out problems with third parties, with entities, corporate entities, even in the remotest places, where they find problems, whether it be deforestation or modern slavery or animal welfare issues. It doesn't matter whether it's Thailand or Indonesia or the United States or France. An NGO will usually be on the case. They'll be there much quicker than the media. They'll certainly be there quicker than their customers and other industrial business stakeholders are. And they call out those problems not only locally, but through networks of NGOs into all the markets of the world. So it doesn't take very long for a problem in Indonesia, in a small company there, maybe literally in the middle of the rainforest, to become a problem for a big food company that's importing, for example, palm oil from a supplier that may be in turn buying from that company. So using NGOs to identify where the problem third parties are is a really powerful way of getting ahead of what would otherwise become a reputational or a media problem, which obviously is much harder to deal with once it's out there. The third thing they do is setting expectations. I mean, a huge amount of NGO communication is directed at the general public. It's also directed at key stakeholders, whether they be investors, as I mentioned earlier, but also market customers, retailers who are deciding whether to stock a particular product or a particular company's product range, whether it be commercial customers of that company. It could be large-scale procurement, for example, public sector procurement. Public sector procurement agencies are under a lot of pressure to adopt standards in sustainability that go beyond what business normally does. So NGOs are tapping into all these different channels of influence, whispering into their ear, briefing them with technical reports, very well informed. I mean, I remember once sitting in, in fact, we organized actually an engagement meeting between a group of NGOs and a group of banks. And the first thing that the bank said after the meeting was they just couldn't believe how well informed the NGOs were. That one of them said, the NGOs seem to know more about our business than we do. And they deserve a lot of respect. They have a deep understanding. It's often very narrow. But nonetheless, if they've got an expert on palm oil supply or banking and Eastern Europe, that's a source of expertise that's worth listening to, if only to help to recognize the kinds of problems that are coming through, and it's going to be able to take preventative action. And the fourth area, really perhaps the most important thing, is that they set standards for you and for your peer companies that help to raise expectations, but also raise the level of attainment in areas like sustainability across the whole sector. I don't think we can ever overestimate how powerful this line of influence is. I remember, again, working with a large food company in the United States, and they had a cooperative relationship with one of their loudest opponents for many years, specifically to raise standards in a particular area. I won't go into the detail of it. It was to do with agriculture. But the point that the NGO made to me was the reason why they invested so much time and energy in this relationship with this large food company. They said that we can achieve more in 4 weeks of conversation with this company than we could by trying to change the habits of farmers over 5 years. So they recognize that the power of big buyers to carry through their agendas is enormous. It's almost like that famous saying of Archimedes about, if you had a lever and a fulcrum in the right place, you could move the earth. And that's what NGOs think about big business. Big business for them, large companies, or even medium-sized companies, are not simply problems for them. They're actually the fulcrum by which they can change the behaviors of entire markets. So they recognize this as really powerful ways to carry through their agendas. And that means they've got a huge incentive not only to raise standards, but also to work with companies like you to make those standards stick.
Robert, we have 2-3 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. And on that point about recognizing good guys, this is actually a strategy that's been becoming very important for NGOs in the last few years. This chart, which comes from our data, because we not only qualitatively look at what NGOs are saying, but we also quantify it so we can see the trends and patterns. This shows the increase in the amount of praise that NGOs distribute to companies across the range month by month. And you can see it's on a very steady and clear trend over the last few years. So this recognizes that companies are just as easily able to get praise from NGOs, which most people actually assume never happens, as to get criticism from them. And NGOs use this to play what they would call the good guys against the bad guys. So they not only use this to call out good practice, but also to put pressure on those companies that are laggards to improve. And one of their arguments, which is, of course, very compelling, is if your competitor's doing it, why can't you do it? And that's a strategy that's become very important for NGOs, as I say, in the last few years. In terms of the trends that you need to watch. I went back over our recent data for the purpose of preparing this presentation. And there's some things that really stood out to us, and me and my colleagues, things that you need to be thinking about in terms of either issues that are new or issues that have been rising in importance in the last year. The most obvious one, which Allison has already referred to, is the protection of suppliers during COVID-19. And this is about a lot more than just protecting employees. It's actually about protecting the livelihoods of the people that work for the companies that you buy from. There has been rather a lot of sudden cancellation of orders, understandable when you've got fashion chains that suddenly can't open their shops anymore. But this has caused a huge furore in the countries that rely on those kinds of orders for not only for their GDP, but also for the individual livelihoods of workers. And the NGOs are all over the companies that are not doing enough to look after their suppliers and behave in an ethical way. But we're also seeing more and more pressure on the carbon footprint of suppliers. So it's not enough to worry about your own footprint. You need to carry that through to your entire supply chain. Living wage in agricultural supply chains. Again, how is the farming system working where you're buying? It's not enough to say, well, you're providing values to agricultural suppliers. You're now being made increasingly responsible for how those farms are actually managing their own labor forces. A big worry now is deforestation link. We've seen the forest fires in Brazil running out of control. There's a lot of pressure now not to buy from suppliers that are in any way linked to forced deforestation. Freedom to organize. That's about labor rights, the ability to form a union. This is becoming a big problem for the fashion sector and electronics sector in Asian countries, which might claim that they have a free trade union, but clearly don't. And one that's occurring right the way across the board, not just in developing countries, but also in the United States and in Europe, is gender and minorities discrimination. This is a new area for NGOs, but they're taking it very seriously. And they're looking at not only at the sort of obvious cases of discrimination, but also systemic discrimination, areas like the pay and conditions of certain kinds of workers versus other kinds of workers, whether that be women versus men or low-grade versus high-grade workers. So all of these are not only challenges that you as companies are facing, but also you've got to recognize that NGOs are developing into campaigns, and they're preparing, if they haven't done already, to identify the good guys and the bad guys, and to make that sort of information very public, both to the public, but also to your other stakeholders and your investors. So it will be used as a stick to beat you with, but there's also an opportunity for you to engage on those issues and make sure that the NGOs know that you're doing good work there. So that's all I've got to say for this afternoon, so thank you very much.
Maria? You are on mute.
Oh, hi. Sorry, apologies about that. I was just saying that we're having quite a lot of questions coming in from the audience. I want to make sure that we have 10 minutes at the end to go through those questions. And I had one for Robert that I wanted to discuss, but I'll keep it for the end. So we're going to move on to Ibtisen. And we wanted to bring her in because we're discussing how we're seeing this corporate behavior starting to accelerate at a faster pace than regulation in some areas. But that doesn't mean that regulation is necessarily staying stagnant. Ibtisen, what are you seeing from regulators in this perspective, from your financial crime or regulatory perspective?
Thank you, Maria. It's a very interesting topic. And as I'm sure many of our listeners know from experience, the Middle East is a very dynamic and diverse market to do business in, and it showcases as well a broad range of regulatory approaches by the authorities in different countries. So whilst we do not necessarily see a monolithic approach that aligns the regulatory development across our countries, there are a number of indicators across our jurisdictions that do indicate that Middle Eastern markets are progressing towards standards that are more in line with international best practice. Although, of course, I must say there's still a lot to be done, a lot of work to be done. It's work in progress, and we are working towards getting there. But before we get into that, I would like to comment briefly on what Allison and Robert had mentioned in terms of the culture shift assimilating sustainability and compliance, as well as the potential that companies have to use innovation and data analytics to extract commercial value from compliance functions. These are developments that are happening at the cutting edge of business culture, and it will be some time before this will be the predominant approach for businesses in the Middle East. So currently, I would say that the prevailing approach to compliance that we see in the financial crime sphere is still very much focused on risk mitigation rather than value positive approaches. And this is certainly one of the challenges that businesses are facing in terms of bad cost compliance against the various risks associated with contracting with third parties. So if you look at my first slide, so the first slide clearly shows you like what are the comparing, when you compare the costs, basically, I'll let you have a look at all those costs. But if you look at the primary causes for concern that businesses in the Middle East raise when they are assessing their risk exposure, the focus is very much on their legal and regulatory liability, but also the reputational risk. And increasingly, we are seeing with raising awareness around cybercrime issues and data breaches. But you are right, however, that the dynamics of how these risks are perceived are shifting. And for example, the reputational risks are commonly being prioritized over strict black letter regarding readings of the law, and the information sharing initiatives for combating financial crime are also growing in favor as companies seek to gain assurance over their obligations and risk awareness. So, for example, by staying up to speed and abreast of common methodology for financial crime that we have witnessed in our jurisdiction, and understanding the reporting requirements. Without going into too much detail, the imbalance between the compliance and the third-party risk factors has propagated the de-risking approach that is now a common feature of regulated businesses, particularly, as you know, in the financial sector, when it comes to working in high-risk jurisdictions or working with high-risk partners. This is obviously not a sustainable approach, so I think it's fair to say that we can expect that the more sophisticated businesses based in the region will ultimately follow leading examples of sustainable compliance that are exhibited by international companies where possible, and that the regulators also will cooperate with the private sector in facilitating this transition, as we have already started to see. Now, to shift back to the issue of how the regulations are driving the approach to compliance, I'll show you the slide number 2, which relates to the Transparency International Corruption Index. And as I mentioned before, one of the defining characteristics of the Middle East regulatory landscape is the cross-border discrepancies, even between neighboring jurisdictions. So, of course, corruption controls is an excellent example of this phenomenon, because the legislative framework around bribery and corruption has transformed so drastically in some countries and at different rates. As you can see from the Transparency International most recent Corruption Perception Index of 2019, which was published back in Jan this year, the variation between the perceived corruption level in the Middle East ranges from some of the worst scores in the world, concentrated around conflict zones, to levels like those in the UAE that surpass even the US or some European countries. So the CPI, of course, is not a ranking of regulatory conditions, but as an indicator of perception and experiences, I think it's useful in gauging how companies will assess their third-party risks in local jurisdictions, and in turn also how that will influence their approach to compliance measures. This is something that we actually see very frequently with our clients from international jurisdictions who are looking to modify, for example, their internal compliance procedures in order to account for the increased risks that are posed by transacting with third parties in jurisdictions that do not necessarily have the same regulatory obligations. So that's a very common trend. And one of the most common devices that we see international companies using to protect themselves actually is like focusing on the contractual terms also that mandate that third parties would follow and abide by the internal code of ethics and also the anti-corruption policies. So I mean, I must say that naturally we are also seeing Middle Eastern companies recognizing that companies that do have these compliance programs in place, even though they are not strictly required by the regulators, are more likely, of course, to be successful in engaging with international business partners who would expect that there is a certain standard of conduct. And that, I think, by itself is a promising step towards bringing sustainability and compliance functions into the same space. Now, if we move to the next slide, so you can see that those are like, it's a summary of the trends in the sustainable compliance practices, basically, that I put together. And from the regulators and law enforcement authorities themselves, there are 3 points that I would like to highlight as being the predominant factors that are driving third-party risk management from a financial crime perspective. The first one is the ability of financial institutions and the regulated entities to outsource their due diligence functions that are related to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing functions. There is an implicit recognition by the UAE regulators, for example, that contracting with third parties is a necessary development for modern business practices, as it allows, of course, businesses to increase their capacity to carry out their commercial activities. But nonetheless, it does not absolve regulated entities from legal liability in the event that these functions are carried out in a manner that's considered to be inadequate for any reason. On the other hand, recognizing the necessity of adding third parties to business operations does not significantly change the way that businesses based in the UAE will manage their third-party risk. The second point that is relevant, I think, and related in this respect, as it regards the increasing reporting obligations of regulated entities and the broad powers of the authorities to request information from businesses in the course of regulatory or criminal investigations even. So companies are required to ensure that their internal records related to third parties are up to date, updated and accessible, of course, at all times. And failure to provide information on request can lead, of course, to sanctions for companies that were subject to the request. So the increased interaction and information sharing with regulatory and law enforcement agencies is driving companies as well to adopt a cautious approach to compliance by, for example, collecting more information and undertaking a more thorough due diligence process prior to initiating a business relationship. And finally, and the other point I wanted to highlight is the third point, which is increasing instances where companies are held liable for the actions of third parties, where they are viewed to be acting in their capacity as agents. We have seen this in circumstances where, for example, some of the cases we had where we advised our clients because the third party they have been carrying out various functions, for example, sales and technical consultancy mandates, which only emphasized on the need for businesses to balance the compliance and the business objectives. It's one thing that, of course, outsourcing is allowed, but it needs to be done to the right people and in the right way. So to draw all of these elements together, I think that the current state of compliance culture in the Middle East for financial crime issues is still some way, behind capitalizing on the value-added sustainability approach. There are, however, as I said, certain features of compliance programs that are being driven by a combination of business dynamics and regulatory development. And I think it's fair to say also that most businesses are currently adapting and working towards adapting their compliance functions and the business culture based on the following. So, number one, moving towards a risk-based approach so that compliance efforts are concentrated on high-risk activities, and that's crucial for businesses to keep this in mind. The second very important point, I think, and from experience and in light of the cases that we have been handling in our financial crime practice, cultivating and ensuring that there is really this culture of compliance from the top, so that the compliance procedures are consistently implemented. Of course, as I said, there's always room for improvement. And I recall one of the survey that was conducted by Refinitiv that highlighted that 51 of external business relationships were not subject to due diligence at the onboarding phase. So it tells us that there's still work to be done and there's still room for improvement, but those are key elements, I think, without which we cannot develop or progress in our various jurisdictions, regardless of where we are. The third point is also, I think, abandoning the high-risk practices such as the use of introducers or relationship consultants, which was previously common in the Middle East. The fourth point I would want to emphasize on is the investment that is necessary technological solutions for compliance that will reduce both the human error and the burden on the regulated entities. Of course, these are not sustainability-specific trends, but they are, as the current drivers of compliance evolution in the Middle East, they will be critical in driving compliance culture towards the more sophisticated models that are emerging in certain jurisdictions which are ahead of us. These points, as I said, are really pretty much related to financial crime, but naturally, they do also feed into the broader sustainability and governance issues with criminal elements, such as the human and wildlife trafficking, which also deploy, as we know, cross-border payment networks to effect bribes and conceal the proceeds of crime. So I would like also to point out that many Middle Eastern countries, but particularly those in the GCC that have long-term development strategies, also have ambitious sustainability objectives in place. So, for example, relating to the environmental goals, such as using renewable energy, carbon neutral business development, recycling, as well as social development obligations related to corporate social responsibility. So that, I think, will likely see the trend in compliance that I have highlighted today.
30 more seconds, and we'll have to move on because we won't have time for Q&A otherwise.
No, absolutely. That's why I was just finishing and saying that, yeah, that will likely see the trends in the compliance that I have highlighted today, and that it spreads in other areas as the compliance framework advances. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and sorry to interrupt, but we have got a few questions, and I wanted to at least take a couple of them. There are a couple on a similar topic. One of the participants is saying there is an expectation that the compliance culture should not crush for profitability when it comes to balancing between business sustainability. Where do you draw the line in order to be balanced? And there is another one along the same line saying compliance is sometimes anti-sustainability. It blocks forward thinking and innovation. Allison, do you want to comment on those?
Sure. So I think there is certainly sometimes cause for tension between compliance and sustainability, and the view that compliance is all about process and all about rules and blocks more innovative thinking. I don't think that's always the case. I think the most effective compliance officers I've ever met have been those that think about themselves as change agents and that really prioritize positive relationships within the company. And I think this is really the big kind of driver of trying to move compliance to a more strategic view. And as I mentioned earlier, would be my big pitch for why compliance needs to be working at least hand in hand with sustainability, even if they're not fully aligned. So I think that is the old-fashioned view of compliance. The old-fashioned view or the cynical view, rather, of sustainability, I've heard it referred to as the paramilitary wing of the marketing department. So the idea that this is really about telling a good news story and having brochures with pictures of smiling children and showing all these great things you're doing, but not connecting them to the core business. So I think the big picture trends we've talked about are kind of affecting both functions. And the biggest picture trend that we might highlight is really the shift to stakeholder capitalism driven by Larry Fink and the Business Roundtable and other people. So a lot of what all three of the speakers have talked about is thinking about managing all our stakeholders. So investors, regulators, customers, suppliers, and the general public, thinking about how to balance those interests and to respond and anticipate those interests is a really important role for both compliance and sustainability. But it is a shift from shareholder value to stakeholder capitalism. That's a big shift. I think it's going to accelerate because of the pandemic. And that's my argument for why compliance is not just about rules and processes, and sustainability is not just about nice marketing brochures.
Thank you, Alison. Robert, we have a question perhaps for you. Is it reasonable to think of NGOs as raising problems and investors as asking for solutions?
It's a good question. I think what we're seeing is that investors are more and more prepared to intervene, to be activists in the traditional term of the word activist investors. And that is a significant switch. Although if you talk to the NGOs, they say that actually that change is much less apparent than apparent. Relatively few investors, even those that purport to be led by ESG considerations, use their proxies to significantly criticize or try to influence management decisions in companies, even when they have the opportunity to do so. But what we do here is that there's a lot of behind-the-scenes conversations, and undoubtedly NGOs are very influential in setting the agendas for those conversations that investors have certainly with major companies. And of course, increasingly, we are seeing decisions made on shareholdings, on portfolios, which directly affect the companies that are perceived to be laggards, or on the other side, to be seen as to be leaders in many of these issues. So I would say that on that basis, yes, NGOs they're setting the agendas. Investors are delivering that agendas where it really counts. But a lot of other players are also very influential, from customers to markets to suppliers to retailers and channels and so forth. And of course, employees as well, which are increasingly targeted by NGOs to use their internal influence within companies.
Thank you. Quickly, one question, Alison, 30 seconds. Do you think that the new rules coming from the European Union will turn ESG into a direct compliance issue?
I don't know about a direct compliance issue, but I do feel very confident that what we are going to see is the increased professionalization of ESG. So there are a lot at the moment of overlapping and fragmented metrics. There's a lot of reliance on self-disclosure. There's a lot of, we've got a policy on human rights, therefore we must be doing a good job. Now I think there is a lot of attention on what good ESG performance really means. There are a lot of very powerful stakeholders trying to kind of codify and make this more mature. So I think over the next few years, we are going to see something much more systemic and much more useful and much more like today's accounting standards. There'll be much more credibility and much more consistency. And I think that is very, very welcome, though many implications that I can't discuss within 30 seconds, unfortunately.
Sorry. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. But feel free, there are quite a number of questions. We will try to answer them, get back to you after the webinar. Email us, tweet us directly if you have any other questions that you have not raised today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Allison, Robert, and Ibtisen for your insights. As I mentioned before, we do have a second webinar as part of this series that takes place on the 26th of March under the title Value Creating Third-Party Risk Programs, taken from some of the issues that came up today. We're going to get more practical in that webinar. You have all the details about it under the resources section, and I really look forward. I'm going to moderate that one, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you then. The webinar has been recorded and it will be available online. And if you would like to receive that recording, other resources, companion materials, or speak to a Refinitiv risk specialist, submit your details on the survey that will appear on your screen once I finish speaking. Thank you again for joining us today, and take care.